Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. In this episode, we're going to be discussing Iran. Now, as we've, of course, been following in the news, on September 16th, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in hospital after being detained by Iran's so-called morality police. Medical reports say that Mahsa died of a heart attack, but critics believe that she was injured by police, leading to her death. There have been ongoing protests, sometimes violent, in parts of Iran as well as worldwide, highlighting not only her case, but the issue of enforced hijab, as well as other grievances that many have with the Iranian government. Now, the estimated death toll from the protests in Iran is more than 100 at this point, and that includes, of course, security forces as well. Western nations have further sanctioned Iran at this time, possibly making life harder for the very people that they claim to want to liberate. Iranian officials have expressed their sympathy as well as their regret over Mahsa's death, but have also cautioned that Iran's adversaries are using this as an excuse to push for regime change. Has a legitimate protest been overtaken by vested interests, or is the Iranian government deflecting attention? We're going to try to answer those and other questions in this discussion that we're going to have with our esteemed panelists who are joining us live today. We're joined by Dr. Sadeqi, who is a political analyst. She has a PhD in North American Studies from the University of Tehran. We're also joined by Sara, Haghdoosti, who is the executive director of Win Without War, which is an organization that works towards a progressive foreign policy. Sara and Setareh, salam to you both, and thank you both for joining us today on The Scope. Setareh, I'll get right into it, and I want to start off with the root causes of what we're seeing, right? And that is the Mahsa Amini case. What are your thoughts about that? How that was handled by officials, and what really happened in your opinion?
Well, I think, the campaigns in Persian and within Iran against the so-called morality police, which in Farsi actually the word is the guidance patrol, had started well before this incident. And for years, people, including religious ones and including those who are pro-government, have been warning that this is not helping and this is making people angry. Women are being harassed and disrespected. I personally remember that I was taking part of this campaign that was online on Twitter and Instagram using hashtags in Farsi against the morality police. But then the tragic death of Mahsa Amini made everyone even more angry. And I think personally, I do believe that the account by the government does not indicate much contradictions, but at the same time, it does not change anything. The fact that a 22-year-old young girl has been going through so much pressure that led to her death in police custody is by itself very outrageous, and I think that's something that the government should handle. But I think the government tried in doing some things to kind of show that they are willing to change policies, but at the same time, certain stances taken by certain government personalities have actually fueled these legitimate protests and made it very difficult for people to want to give up.
Sara, I wonder what your thoughts are about this as well, because do you think that, and do you agree with Setareh that essentially, if I'm paraphrasing what Setareh said there, but this was mishandled by officials from the get-go, right? Where there wasn't possibly as much transparency as there should have been from the get-go. Obviously, there is the whole question around the need for a morality police anyways.
So I think there's a few things that I want to say on this. One, the Iranian government's account of the death of Mahsa Amini has been very clearly repudiated by her family and almost unanimously by many, many human rights organizations. So I just want to clearly state that. I think what we're seeing here, and for many of your viewers who might not know, being harassed by the morality police in Iran is very common for a lot of people. And over the last few weeks and months, the political context has been that people in Iran are genuinely struggling under what is incredibly hard conditions in the Iranian economy. And instead of focusing on that, and instead of focusing on how do you make people's lives easier, President Rezai chose to instead embolden the morality police and focus on enforcing incredibly strict policies around the hijab. So what I think we're seeing here in these protests is that compulsory hijab is a spark, but also a much wider symbol of deeper frustration people have with this government. And part of the reason why I say this is the key anthem for these protests that we've seen is a song called Baraye, which talks about all the different reasons why people are protesting. And it highlights the hundreds of daily indignities people have to face in Iran because of decisions this government has made. And I think people are genuinely tired of a government that always prioritizes violence over doing anything to make people's lives in the country better.
Setareh, of course, I'd like to get your thoughts about what Sara said. And I also wanted to add this on. When it comes to reforms, right, in your opinion, what stage are we at in that conversation about reforms? Because, I also do read Farsi as well. And I've read some statements from some key officials as well as some key religious scholars in the country saying that there should be some form of reform. Now, obviously, all of them disagree to differing levels about what kind of reforms we need. But what are your thoughts about what stage we're at in that regard? I mean, do you think that that's something that will happen very soon, or is this a long-term process?
Well, I think the abolishment of the morality police in some form is not something far-fetched, and we're probably going to see at least some sort of reform very soon. People have already seen a significant decrease of the morality police around the cities everywhere. And I should also mention that while it is true that in major cities there were a lot of these kinds of patrols and a lot of women have been subjected to the maltreatment by these police, we should remember that the morality police does not exist in a lot of cities. And it is different in different cities. For example, if you go to a traditional city, because naturally people have a different standard of observing the dress code, they have fewer experiences of being stopped, for example, by the morality police. And it's also that, I mean, it hasn't been helpful at all. And a lot of even people who believe in hijab think that this is giving a very negative image of them and it's provoking violence against people who observe hijab by like random people who have been subjected to the brutal treatment by the morality police. But yes, I think that we are seeing key figures talking about how this has been only harming the country. It has not, even within religious context, it has not helped people. It has not encouraged anyone to want to observe the hijab. And there's a need for some kind of reform, not only with the morality police, but also with the mandatory hijab law. But I mean, I think in order to understand the Iranian society better, we have to understand that there are still people who believe, and it's a large proportion of the population. Maybe they're not by now, they're not the majority, but still a significant proportion of the population that still wants the mandatory hijab to be enforced. Yeah. But even them do not agree with the morality police. So I think there's some sort of consensus that the morality police should be abolished. And that makes it easier for it to, because the public opinion is agreeing with that. And right. I also think that the reform has to come from inside, and we have to take steps like and gradually work on it. On a lot of women, including religious women, have been working towards it, have been raising awareness,
Setareh,
trying to
if you allow
educate
me, because
other
on that point you just made about the reforms coming from inside, if you allow me, because we're going to go into a break in just about 3 minutes. So I wanted to get Sara's thoughts on that as well. Sara, I wanted to in fact ask you, and I'm glad Setareh brought up this issue of reforms from within the country versus being forced, in a sense, like their hand being forced from outside the country. What are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, Iranian society, as Setareh said, is unique in the sense that they really do not respond very well to outside pressure and outside influence or intervention, however we want to term that, and they would want to do things on their own terms.
Absolutely. I believe that the only people who should be making a decision about the future of Iran are people in the country. And I think what we're seeing in these protests, we're seeing people chant that, saying end to the dictatorship, and saying no to this current regime and also no to the Shah. What we're seeing is a genuine desire for people to have control over their lives and a say in their government. And I think it is really important not to ignore that and really acknowledge what protesters in the country have been demanding.
But I mean, if I may just ask you this very quickly, Sara, would this government be surviving if it did still not have majority support?
I think it's really interesting to think about what this government surviving looks like, because we are, like, I agree with Setareh that we're seeing lots of movement towards things like abolishing the morality police. But the demands on what we're seeing, these protests that have lasted for weeks now, are very much moving beyond that. And we're seeing more and more conversations. We're seeing the labor movement and strikes in oil, in various oil companies across the country as well. And this is significant. I think, again, people in Iran have been demanding a say in their own lives since longer than I've been breathing. And I think just desperately want that for themselves.
Very well. We're just going to go into our first break. I'm going to ask, of course, Sara and Setareh to stand by. We're going to be back with both Sara and Setareh after this break, viewers. We're going to continue discussing the situation in Iran. And in this second half, we're going to discuss more of the foreign angle. As we know, Iranian officials have pointed towards outside forces, saying that they are the ones who are fueling the protests/riots that are happening in the country. We'll be back right after this break to discuss that further with Setareh and Sara. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're back here on The Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and we're continuing to discuss the situation in Iran and the ongoing protests in that country since the death of Mahsa Amini, as we discussed there in the first half of this conversation. In this second half, Setareh, I wanted to start with you. I want to ask you very directly about, the fact that Iranian officials have spoken about that what we're seeing now happening on the streets of Iran is something that is being fueled from outside the country. I want to bluntly ask you, if I may, a very direct question. Do you think that this is in some ways a deflection, or do you think that there are actual reasons and there's actual legitimate concerns about outside forces being involved?
Well, the protests that we have seen and the CIA-backed campaigns that we have observed against Iran over the past few years or past decade shows that there are legitimate concerns. But I think there are grievances there, and that makes it easier for foreign forces to be able to exploit them. So the grievances are there, and they are legitimate, and people have every right to want to protest. But there are outside forces that want to exploit it and, derail the protest into something that is bigger. But I think another point that is very important to bear in mind looking into the 2022 protest is that what you see online and the image of the protest that you see online is pretty much exaggerated in comparison to what is actually happening. What is actually happening is very significant in different ways, but in terms of the scale of the protest and the strikes that we have. It is, if you visit Iran and if you live in Iran, you will notice that it is not anything like what is being portrayed on social media, particularly, but also on mainstream media. For example, I can give you, like, I talked to a few tourists yesterday in Esfahan, and they had visited Tehran and Esfahan and a couple of other cities. And I asked them if they saw any signs of these protests. And they said that they didn't, not only the protests, but they didn't see anything on the streets that would show that people have like burned things down or there were destruction or anything. And this doesn't mean that this did not happen, but it means that normal life was not, in most cases, in some cases no, but in most cases, normal life was not disrupted, and protests were going on, but people were also going to work, going to school, going to universities. And in many cities, things have gone back to normal. For example, I have talked to students who took part in the protests in Esfahan, and they are telling me at university, in different universities, and they're telling me that they have already been back to their classes, and their classes are being held, and things are like have calmed down here. So it's very important to not to fall for the image that you see outside of Iran, because it may lead to miscalculations and analysis that is not realistic.
Yeah. And Sara, you know, I'm glad Setareh brought that up, because in fact, Mazyar Bahari, right, who has his own experience certainly in Iran, because he had been detained, especially around the 2009 protests after those elections. Mazyar Bahari wrote, you know, a very detailed article saying that, you know, people need to be very careful about disinformation at this point in time, especially as Setareh there mentioned online. How does, you know, it's tough, isn't it? Because for those of us who are not in Iran to understand specifically what's happening in Iran, you know, you obviously are trying to the best of your knowledge, verify things, but then considering online, the image is sometimes very, very different from what Setareh has described. How does one then decide what's actually going on?
I think there are very reliable sources here. Just this morning, Amnesty International tweeted concern over violent crackdowns that are happening on protesters who are currently protesting in Iran. I think one thing that I also go back to is I have been a part of many social movements across the country, and at the height of movements that have caused significant change, be them during the George Floyd protests in the US, they don't necessarily always shut down entire cities and can still be incredibly significant. So I think being careful on both sides is really important. There are obviously still protests going on. There is clearly things happening, and there's huge amounts of suppression happening. We're seeing journalists being put into jail. We're seeing crackdowns happening at universities. And I want to say, seeing the Iranian government and so many different officials be so open to reform is also a sign of them being genuinely worried about these protests. And when you compare them to other moments, recent moments in Iranian history, where it be 2009 or other things that have flared up, these protests have been going on for much longer than the other ones have. So I think it's too early to say that they've quelled or died down, where we're still seeing a lot of movement from outside of the country.
Setareh, you know, I also wanted to ask about the, did you want to respond, Setareh? Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to say that, yes, it hasn't died out in everywhere that it was happening, but in a lot of cities it has already died down. And, you know, because this was, for example, in 2019, we had protests which were massive, and the crackdown on the protests was also massive. The government said that more than 200 people were killed in the protests because of the police crackdown, obviously, and also other elements that, because, you know, we have a lot of terrorist groups also active at the borders that want to take the opportunity to wreak havoc on the country. But at that time, I personally, because like I remember in my neighborhood, we had total crackdown on the internet. We had massive protests happening. And I did not see anything similar to what I am seeing online, on, for example, Twitter. And you can identify a lot of what we call fake news and disinformation going on, scenes that did not actually happen. I'm talking about, for example, a particular one that was seen from a Turkish drama and was going viral, and retweeted by celebrities around the world with over like 14 million followers, that this was, for example, dad grieving over the death of her daughter. And while things like tragic things are happening that we naturally condemn as human beings, we have to also remember that we need to have a very realistic view of what is happening. And it's very important to hear those voices inside Iran, and
Of course.
see what their observations of the things are.
We just have about 6 minutes left, so I just wanted to get both of your final thoughts, if I may. But I wanted to just shift gears a little bit, because I feel like this is an important point to discuss when it comes to the situation in Iran. And I'll start with you, Sara, when it comes to this. And this is the issue of the hijab, and even just Islam in general, right? And the way that a lot of those conversations outside of Iran are happening, be it on social media, be it even in those protests. There have been sometimes stories of women in headscarves being sometimes physically attacked. I mean, there was a video coming out of Munich, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken, in Germany, but others sometimes just being verbally pressured into saying something in support of this. But it's not necessarily, you can't force someone into doing something like that, right? So what are your thoughts about that? I mean, is this genuinely going into Islamophobic territory where it's really moving too extreme?
I think any attacks on women wearing hijab just because they're wearing hijab is unacceptable. And I think it's important to step back and put this in a broader context. What women in Iran are protesting is compulsory hijab, the not having the option of being able to wear hijab or not. And on top of that, there being the existence of a so-called morality police that harasses them, arrests people, and there's very real violent consequences for women who choose not to follow that law. Or in the case of Mahsa Jina Amini, who was wearing hijab and was still arrested. What we do also see in countries outside of Iran is Islamophobic attacks on women who do choose to wear the hijab. And we've seen this in various countries where they've tried to ban the hijab altogether. And I think it's really important to put this in the context of a larger misogyny that aims to control women. This isn't hard. Women should be allowed to wear whatever they want and be free from harassment or government intervention when they do it.
Setareh, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with what Sara said, and women should be allowed to practice what they believe in. But I also think that we need to understand the Iranian society. It's not a monolithic society. There are a lot of people who still believe in Islam and want to practice Islam. And not only they want to practice Islam and practice hijab, but they also want to see that the Islamic values that they consider not only Islamic, but also as a symbol of fighting imperialism, to be like prevalent and promoted in the society. That doesn't mean that they necessarily believe in the obligatory hijab or the enforcement of the law the way it is being enforced right now. But I think what is missing on especially Western reports of what is going on in the country is that the Iranian society and Iranian women are not waiting for the other countries to impose their liberal, westernized notion of women's freedom or women's bodily autonomy to be brought to them like some sort of democracy. And it's not that everyone is complaining and everyone is totally fed up with what is going on. No, a lot of things that are happening here need long-term education of women and empowerment of women. And we cannot ignore the different groups of people and women that we have and different demands that they have. We have to come into a unified society that learns to respect what different groups want without, labeling or like harassing or without causing some sort of Islamophobic attacks on people, because the Islamophobic attacks have been happening inside Iran too, but they're very minor and it's just very few cases. But that's concerning.
Okay.
I hear people, my
All right,
friends,
Setareh, I do sincerely apologize for cutting off.
Unfortunately,
Unfortunately, the clock is getting the best of us, but I do sincerely appreciate both Setareh and Sara. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting conversation. And of course, viewers, please do send in your comments. I know we will probably possibly be discussing Iran in the coming days as well. Thank you very much for watching this episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV.